There's a story told of a country church many decades ago, before it became common for women to become pastors. The story is that this one small country church had a pastor nominating committee, and they were looking for a pastor, and they had actually decided, and knew it was a little cutting edge at the time, to call a woman to be their pastor. And the story goes that they, in order to introduce this new pastor, they knew it'd be a little scandalous for some members of the congregation. They went and had kind of a hosting fellowship where she preached, and then a little lunch following, and they were pretty excited. Generally, folks were pretty welcoming. There was one older kind of eccentric older guy that they were particularly interested and worried, to be honest, about how he would respond to the calling of a woman to be a pastor. And to their surprise, the fellowship, he came up to her and said, "Well, would you mind going fishing with me tomorrow? I'd like to get to know you better." And she said, sure. And the pastor nominating committee was quite excited. He seemed to be making the effort to get to know her. So the next day, he picks her up, and they go out to the lake, and they get in his boat, and then motor out into the middle of the lake and put out their fishing poles. And then this older eccentric gentleman begins to berate her about this reality that he saw Scripture saying women couldn't be pastors, and how did she think she could be a pastor of a church? And he got so animated and angry that she got quite upset, so she simply stepped out of the boat and walked to the shore. Walked right onto the shore on that water. And so the pastor nominating committee was interested in to know what had happened. And so the next day, talked to the older gentleman. What was his impressions? What did he think? And he said, "I'm not sure about her. I just don't know if a woman can be a pastor. And by the way, she can't even swim." It's interesting. Our beliefs, our prejudices, our ideas about the way the world's supposed to be gets in the way of our really seeing the world. And it is the nature of being human that we do that we construct and create certain beliefs about the world, so much so that all of us, in many ways, it shapes how we see that world, what we believe about it, or how we experience it. And it's sometimes a little odd what we human beings believe about the world. Just recently I came across, I had never heard of this before in the news, I came across a group that called itself the Flat Earth Society. Have you heard of this group? I thought it was a joke, but actually there are people who argue that the moon landing was faked, the pictures of the globe of the earth was faked as well, that the earth really is flat. What a strange thing to believe about the world. And no matter what evidence you see, it runs counter it. There was a person who ran for the Senate in Arizona, in the primary in the Senate in Arizona, who actually believed and said on their Facebook and argued that chemtrails, that water condensation, when a jet flies through the sky, the little white water condensation, she actually believed that was really intended to be a biological agent for mind control. We humans believe, despite the evidence, odd things. The way we construct the world, the way we perceive the world. There's even been surveys of religious belief in this country over the decades that show a startling idea about what people believe. In fact, what was interesting was they found that overall majority of people couldn't name the four Gospels, which was interesting. That an overwhelming majority of folks believed that the line, God helps those who help themselves, is actually in the Bible. And not a large majority, but there was a significant group who believed Joan of Arc was the wife of Noah. Unless we think that belief doesn't have an impact on the world around us, or these kind of idiosyncrasies or eccentric beliefs are outside the main, there are significant parts of the population who believe Barack Obama was not born in the United States and was a Muslim and made his oath on the Quran rather than the Bible. A significant number, there was one guy who believed this to be true, and actually shot up a pizzeria believing it to be a site of human trafficking. There are a number of people who believe 9/11 was planned by the government. And these strange idiosyncratic beliefs impacted the way they saw the world. And the truth be told, it's true of all of us. To be human, in many ways, is to have certain beliefs about the world and the people in the world about us that in some ways, in many ways, can interfere with our interacting with that world and understanding. We have difficulty with ideas that challenge what we believe about the world, don't we? Psychologists have a phrase for that. They call it cognitive dissonance. The truth is that when we encounter evidence that seems to contradict what we believe about the world, the way we think the world works, it creates this tension, this anxiety in us, this sense of cognitive dissonance, because it doesn't match what we expect. And every human being experiences that. And more often than not, despite the evidence in front of us, we'll choose to believe what we believe. All of us. To be human is to do that. One of the assertions of our tradition about Jesus is that he was fully human and fully divine. And we're never really clear about what we mean by divinity and humanity of Jesus. It's a paradox in a way, a sense in which it's very hard for us to kind of hold on to that paradox and polarity. And I have found in my life in ministry that people usually tend to go one way or the other. Tend to emphasize the full divinity or tend to emphasize the full humanity. And often it would depend about what part of the country you lived in. When I served churches in Oklahoma, the Bible Belt, they were far more comfortable with this idea of Jesus as fully divine. They had a little bit more discomfort with Jesus' humanity. And when I served a church in Madison, Wisconsin, the opposite was true. Many folks had far more comfort with saying Jesus was fully human, but a little more discomfort in holding on to the idea of Jesus' divinity, or what exactly that meant. And I think it's probably true that all of us find ourselves on some side of that polarity. In fact, I remember years ago when I started my ministry that one of the big scandals down in Oklahoma was the showing of the movie Last Temptation of Christ, and people actually protested at movie theaters because Jesus was presented as too human. it seemed heretical. And then we come to the text we read this morning. Did you find it as startling as I did? I have a kind of cognitive dissonance about that story. Because my image of Jesus is always inclusive, always welcoming, preaching the grace of God. That I see that message over and over and over again about that's who God is, and that is how I understand him and believe about him as a human being. And then there is this story. Here's this woman, a Canaanite. She's not Jewish. She's a Canaanite. And she comes, a mother, begging for the life of her daughter. Begging. Can you imagine? Can you mothers imagine the hunger, the desire to see your child healed and made whole? And what does Jesus do? We are told he hears this plea, this request, and he doesn't say a word. What's up with that? And then the disciples say to him, well, get her out of here. She's a Canaanite woman. Just get her out. And then he goes on and makes it worse. He says, I came here for the lost sheep of Israel. In other words, not for you. And then there's the line, I got to say this exactly right. Because it's so startling, it doesn't fit how I see Jesus. It says, he says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. And then, but she still cries out, the plea, the mother begging for the life of her daughter. She's pleading, Lord, help me. And he says to her, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Can you imagine an even more dismissive? He's calling her a dog. I don't understand it. It doesn't fit who I see Jesus is and was. And it's really, to be honest, not consistent with the rest of the Gospels. That's not how he normally behaves or acts. So how do I make sense of this interaction? How do I understand and overcome this cognitive dissonance I'm experiencing? Now, there are a number of scholars who argue that Jesus really wasn't saying this to reflect what he thought or believed, but that really what Jesus was doing was emphasizing or illustrating for the disciples around him about a gospel that was going to be much larger than they experienced and believed. And I think that's a right and good interpretation, a way to overcome our cognitive dissonance about that. But I also think one way to think about this text, one way that may unsettle us a little bit, is that when we say Jesus was fully human, we really mean it. That to be human, to really be human, is to have our biases and prejudices, our ways of constructing the world. To have, in a sense, to be human is to be limited and confined and know that we have these discriminating hearts that make choices about who's in and who's out. And to say then Jesus was fully human is to say he knew that experience himself. And the radical message in this story is that Jesus changed his mind. He had one way of looking at the world, and this feisty woman who wouldn't stand down said to him, even the dogs get the crumbs. I know that sounds a little radical. We're more comfortable with Jesus always in control. We're more comfortable with this perfect superhuman being who would never change his mind, who would never make transformations in his life, or never have his heart turned around. But what if the message that's being communicated here is that the nature of being human, the nature of following Jesus, is like Jesus, we have our prejudices and biases challenged. That the path of being human isn't perfection, but transformation. Of hearts and minds that are always open to being changed. That to be human is to change our minds about our own prejudices and biases. And that's challenging, folks, because every single one of us have our ideas about who's right and who's wrong, who's in and who's out, right? Don't we? Every one of us have discriminating hearts that say the other side, they're evil. They're not the lost sheep. They're the dogs, not the true children. Every one of us has those attitudes inside us. There's no avoiding that. That's what it means to be human. But what if the message here is that if even Jesus is willing to turn a different direction, maybe the path of humanity, the path of what it really means to be human is to have our hearts and minds changed in ways we didn't expect. There are a lot of people who say, I've read people who say, I love humanity. It's the individual people I don't really care about, right? Have you heard that before? The individual people I find hard to love. I have a general love for humanity. It's the individuals I find difficult to love. Because people are, let's be honest, difficult to love. But you know what? I find the opposite to be true. I'm actually rather skeptical of humanity. I know our biases and prejudices and brokenness as human beings. I actually find it easier to love the individual human being because I can see them in the midst of their complexities, their contradictions. Even if they don't agree with me, I can see this human being who has a story that I may not agree with, but who has a right to be who they are. So, folks, it's easy to say we love humanity. It's a lot harder to love that contradiction that's sitting next to you. Or that you assume is your neighbor. And the challenge, I think, what Jesus presents to us this morning is a willingness to meet that person where they are. That's what changed Jesus' mind, at least in this story, it would seem. She challenged him, and he was open to being changed. And the question it poses for us is, are we willing to be changed, to have our world expanded, to have our understanding of the contradictions of human beings, and to know each other in the midst of our limitations, our biases, and to be willing to have our hearts, our discriminating hearts, transformed. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.